So good morning, everybody. Great to have you for a very interesting session, I guess, on the topic of the years in the energy scene of hydrogen derivatives, and how they will enter Europe one day, not too far away from today. Best greetings from Berlin, where we're now discussing the results of the last national election. That's on the political scene, of course, the debate we have in the energy scene of the last weeks. Of course, short term, the gas prices were the most prominent issue and still are. Gas prices rocketing and having their effects also on neighboring countries as the electricity market, as the oil and gas market, as the oil and the coal markets. So, of course, this is something that keeps many people nervous in these days, and maybe also for the next winter until spring. But, of course, the longer developments next to these short-term challenges are the long-term journeys, the long-term transformation to climate neutrality. And this is actually the reason why we've chosen today's topic to introduce, as not only direct electrification, but also green molecules, as we call them, will play a major role in this game, whether it is hydrogen, whether it is power to liquids or other e-fuels. At least molecules, green molecules, will be needed. And the question is, where are they produced? How will they be transported to Europe? What role could they play in the future energy markets? And for that reason, we're happy to introduce the results of a very interesting study the European section of the World Energy Council did together with our lead author, Marco Baroni. And I'm very happy to have him today in the call, presenting the results of the study Decarbonized Hydrogen Imports into the EU, Challenges and Opportunities. After we've done that, we will have debates. So if you would maybe wait with your questions and note your questions for the debate that we will have. And of course, also for the comments, the political comments, Mr. Benterbusch from the Ministry of Economic Affairs will add afterwards. But now I'd like to hand it over to Marco, presenting at the most interesting results of this study work. Marco, the floor is yours.
Maybe a quick remark from my side. We are recording the webinar, just for your information. And now, Marco, please go ahead.
Many thanks, Carsten. Many thanks, Mayra. It is a pleasure to be here this morning to present the results of the study. I will put on a few slides, if you allow me, just to help vehiculating some of the key messages, and I will be happy to go back to them in the Q&A session, should you have any specific question about them. First question is, can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. So let me put them in presentation mode 1 second. If it works. Yes. Can you see it?
Yes.
Sorry for asking twice the confirmation, but it's always nice to make sure that that it's working. Good morning again, and without further ado, I will just go to the slides so that we start describing the results. So there is a lot of momentum at the moment about hydrogen in a number of countries. Hydrogen, as Carsten mentioned, the green, or depending on the country, decarbonized at large molecules are a big part, are intended to be a big part of the energy transition strategies, in particular for reaching the hard to abate sectors. Several reports out there, as we mentioned, but we wanted really to look at one specific aspect, and that was the imports, the need for imports, the eventual need for imports into the European Union. If so, why, and other points. So effectively, we wanted to answer 3 broad questions. Why would the European Union need to import decarbonized hydrogen? What would be the conditions to make this possible? And what would be the conditions also for mutual success between exporting and importing countries, so between all the trading partners? We will come back on this topic a few times across the slides. So this is effectively an opportunity to cross the views between the trading partners. But to do that, what we did initially in the study was to try to have an understanding of what the future domestic demand and supply in the EU could be. So what would be the drivers for the imports, if there would be, reviewing, of course, the current and the possible future evolution of production costs and transportation costs, and of course, what type of implications all of this would have on energy security. I will insist a little bit, not only energy security, but also technology security, and the interactions with all the other parts of the energy system, and in particular with the power sector. Now, before we proceed to look at the results of the study, I would like to make one important note, which is about the technology neutrality. So what we decided was to step a bit away from the colors of the different means of production, but rather concentrate on the CO2 emissions of the hydrogen production. So the idea is to say we don't necessarily want to be deciding which type of technology will be the winner, but rather what type of conditions they would need to respect. For the time being, there is a clear limit set by the European Union, but this, of course, could change over time, and that we thought would be a little bit stopping what I think has been already defined at the launch 2 days ago as stopping the color war, but really concentrating on decarbonized versus emitting versus emitting technologies for hydrogen production. So looking at the situation today in Europe, we know that there is a sizable amount of demand in Europe, but it's still significantly low. We're talking about something in the order of 10 million tons of hydrogen demand, which is about 330 terawatt hour of hydrogen demand, which is mostly met by production done with emitting sources. The vast majority of it is steam methane reformer, so SMRs, close to the demand centers. When we look forward to 2030, sorry, just one little thing in brackets, we most often looked at 2 time horizons, 2030 and 2050. One, to see what we need to do in the shorter term, 2030 being shorter in energy transformation terms, and 2050 in terms of having the sense of direction. So if we look at 2030, we see that demand would increase, is set to increase, thanks in particular to the different measures taken in different strategies of the different countries. Production should at least the decarbonized production should cover at least the incremental demand from today to 2030. Of course, with the aim of producing more, so starting substituting the gray, the emitting production, but we don't see that this will fully happen. So leaving a space for either imports of decarbonized hydrogen, or still having some emitting production, but of course also leaving the space for developing SMRs with CCS, so with a role for CCS to be played by 2030 in several countries. Several countries are already considering it and are looking to develop this technology further. When we look at 2050, well, we looked at a number of studies and we saw that the demand for hydrogen in the longer term is has a very large range. The one that represented here is just one of the scenarios of the European Union, but in reality, this span is much larger. Of course, from when I'm talking about the future demand of hydrogen, I'm talking about in deep decarbonization scenarios, because otherwise the growth is very minimal. But also there are studies that look at higher amounts of hydrogen demand. So this is really the range of provided by the different scenarios of the Commission. We then estimated ourselves what could be the production in the different countries. We did a country-by-country analysis, and we saw that the level of production would be significantly lower. I will come back in the next slides on the reasons behind this lower production. The production having as well a significant range, but with an impact on the imports, really the essence, the focus of the study, that is really significant, and it can span in between, estimated in our study, in between less than 18 million tons of hydrogen and 50, so with a very large range. Now, how large is this range? What do these numbers represent? Well, if we compare them to the current natural gas methane imports, well, we can see that we're talking about a bit more than, but more or less half of today imports of methane to the European Union in energy terms. Of course, when it comes to the value, so the money involved in this trade, it will depend on the current gas prices or more moderate gas prices for methane, and the evolution of hydrogen prices for the hydrogen side. But in terms of energy, we are talking about something in the highest part of the range of about half of today's gas imports. In the future slides, I will present you the results for the demand side of a midpoint at around 60 million tons, or about 2,000 terawatt-hour of hydrogen demand. So keep in mind this 60, because it will come back several times in the next slides. Now, what are the consequences of all this? There are several consequences. One is, of course, on energy security, lower imports because also of higher production in the EU, but also consequences on the technology security. This is a topic that has already emerged when we look at where the solar panels are built, the wind blades, the batteries. Well, that will, of course, attain also to electrolyzers. So with a big question mark on the manufacturing side of all this deployment. On the other side, can have, as we mentioned, a significant impact on energy prices, prices of hydrogen in the future, and we'll come back in the future slides about this. Sorry, I will have to start the my clock. So what are the drivers for such what are the reasons for the lower production costs? Well, there could be two reasons. One is cost, one is volumes. We will briefly look at both. In the first case, if we look at costs, we have analyzed a number of European countries, the production costs for several technologies to 2030 to 2050. As you can see, here is the case of Germany. And the production costs in a number of course, of countries with good resources, renewables, or gas. We mainly looked at electrolyzers, so electricity-based hydrogen production, and gas-based hydrogen production. We saw that despite, of course, the fact that the production costs in the exporting countries would be significantly lower in some cases to a number of European countries, not all and not all technologies, but generally that is the overall trend. Well, the transportation costs often offset this difference, bringing the costs to about a similar level between the delivered cost of hydrogen produced within Europe and coming from imported from exporting countries, so from trading partners. When I'm saying about the same level, is not that the difference of $10, $20 is not important, but there are significant uncertainties around these numbers. I will briefly come back on this. So we can see that more or less we're talking about similar levels. So a very important role of transportation costs, and we will come back. Again, I'm anticipating in a number of slides what will be then explained a little bit more in other slides. Now, Germany has emerged from the analysis, but I'm sure that you know it much better than me, as the biggest importer for hydrogen in the future. When I'm talking about hydrogen, effectively, I'm talking about hydrogen in terms of pure hydrogen imports, but also hydrogen used for production of derivatives. So that takes into account both forms, so the hydrogen needed for both uses. It's not moving. For some reasons, it's not moving. Sorry, I am trying to get to the next slide, and of course, here we go. Can you see the transport cost slide? May I ask just a confirmation? Because I had a problem of the presentation moving.
That's the beginning. We see.
Yes,
yeah.
perfect. It's empty. It's empty. It should be empty. Has some animation. Thanks a lot. So we talked about the transportation, and transport has a very important role to play. Of course, the question will be how will the transport evolve, mainly pipe or seaborne, in what type of forms, pure hydrogen or derivatives of some type of some kind. We looked at a number of analysis done by what is available in literature, and of course it's kind of obvious that the cost increases with distance. That is quite normal. This represents 36 inches pipeline new for importing to the European Union. Compared to shipping either of hydrogen or of ammonia with different costs, of course, where it's already clearly evident that for the first few thousand kilometers is much more convenient to import via pipeline. The more the distance grows, the more shipping becomes interesting. But of course, the pipelines, several studies have different costs, so there is quite a range between the cost that I showed, a higher cost that has been estimated in by the IEA in its 2019 study, but also in the EHB study, the average between repurposed and new pipelines within the European Union, though. So quite a range of costs that would have quite a different impact on the graph that I showed you before, depending on the origin, depending on all the different elements that constitute this graph. And of course, depending on which countries are we considering. So if we're considering North Africa, for example, to Spain, or Morocco to Germany, or Russia to Austria, or of course longer distances like Australia or Chile. That's why I did lump them together. So Australia or Chile to the two different ports in the European Union. So one thing, two things that are very important here is the fact that there is still a quite big uncertainty on these costs, and the importance of pipelines for the shorter ranges, but also the difference between the possible cost between repurposed and new pipelines. I mentioned the uncertainties, and when we're looking at uncertainties, well, we need to remember that those numbers that we saw earlier on, well, they are each one of those components have already a significant uncertainty in each part, and effectively the overall cost we estimated could be has an uncertainty that varies in between 40% down and 50% higher than what we showed. That's why I said that the costs were very similar, because of course we need to take into account all these different uncertainties that will be resolved over time. The more this infrastructure is put in place. The other, sorry, I try to sometimes accelerate a little bit to be able to stay in the times. One of the other very important elements for understanding why imports, and so where is the reason for the limited production in Europe, is looking at volumes. So, of course, we are all very aware that, of the importance of electricity as a vector for decarbonization in the different countries. So, and the need to decarbonize electricity production, also to be able to increase the electrification of end-use sectors. The estimate is about an increase of fourfold of solar PV and wind capacity from today to 2050 to be able to reach this goal within the European Union. Well, if we were to add, so to meet all the 60 million tons that we mentioned before with PV and wind in the future, well, this increase should not increase fourfold, but about eightfold. So we would need to increase electricity demand by almost 3,000 terawatt-hour of electricity generation. To keep in mind that 3,000 terawatt-hour of electricity generation is about the entire electricity generation of the European Union today, all sources together. So we would need to add another Europe in terms of generation to be able to meet all the 60 million tons to be produced. If it was all through electrolysis, all from PV and wind. We then looked at the different countries. We saw the challenges associated with the expansion already to meet the first increase, the one to decarbonize electricity for electricity uses. And we saw that there were limitations in the different countries. And so in our analysis, we arrived at the conclusion that about 30 million tons could be satisfied by production within the EU. Of course, with some countries exporting to other European countries, but still, as a whole, the EU would produce about half, and the other half would need to be imported. This is a very important point, because then, of course, if you combine it with the transportation costs and so with the advantage of neighboring countries, well, we can see what happens, and that's what we did in this study with the neighboring countries. We had a lot of interactions with North African countries and Russia in particular. There are clear growing emissions in North Africa, but there is one thing that we need to remember. The reason for this graph to be so similar to the European Union is to get a sense feel exactly of what is happening in North Africa. North Africa, like many developing regions, has really a big increase in electricity demand that is expected in future years. The decarbonization of this electricity generation will, of course, require a very high increase of PV and wind capacities. The results here are taken from the OME, the Observatoire Méditerranéen pour l'Énergie, that we collaborated with to produce this study. From their deep decarbonization scenario for the area, the PROMED, and where it's clear that the capacity of PV and wind needs to multiply by 2050 by a factor of 35 times. Now, to be able to export to meet 40-45% of the exports to the European Union, of those 30 that were missing, well, the capacity will need to be 70, to increase 70 times instead of 35. So a very big increase. This, of course, poses the question of the additionality, the issue that you know very well, that is posed within the EU, but that is very important for the neighboring countries as well, of acceptability of a number of issues that need to be resolved before this huge increase can come through. And of course, the issue of infrastructure, the issue of what are the conditions for these investments to happen. We will come back on this again. So actually, we come back straight now. When we looked at the import of 30 million tons, it's slightly more, it's 30.4, but doesn't matter, of 30 million tons of hydrogen to 2050, of course, this can have quite a different composition between electrolysis, so electricity-based and gas-based, depending on economics, but also depending on policies in place. So we go back to the decarbonized or the green. There is quite a policy debate about that. In this case, we looked at a mixture of both electrolysis and SMR with CCS and some pyrolysis a little bit, but starting in bigger volumes after 2030. And looked at what are the investments involved in it. Well, when we look at the investments involved in it, of course, you have the investments in electrolyzers, the ones in PV and wind plants, the one on SMR with CCS and pyrolysis, hydrogen producing plants, and of course the supply of methane. Remembering that this second part needs to resolve the fugitive emissions, otherwise the conditions for to meet the CO2 emissions would not be met. These amount to almost 500 is 480 something billion dollars estimated over the period 2021 to 2050. Remembering that we need to add to this infrastructure with its big uncertainty. So we estimated the infrastructure cost to be more or less in between 250 and 500 billion cost using the ranges that we were seeing in the earlier slide and in several other studies. So reaching to the higher amount, about $1 trillion, we indicated a figure of 900. That is more or less the midpoint of that uncertainty coming out of our analysis. Of course, all of these investments, we need to see what are the conditions to access it and to meet it. And what would be a very important part would be the access to low cost financing. Carsten, do I have 5 more minutes just to finish the last 2 slides?
2 minutes for the last slides, is that fine?
Okay. So last 2 conditions and conclusions. The conditions of mutual success, very important to remember. The coordination of infrastructure is not hydrogen by itself. It needs to be coordinated with between hydrogen, electricity, gas, heat, and not just within the EU. That's a very important part, but between EU and the trading partners. There is the need of implementing a very clear regulatory framework. Otherwise, investments will not be forthcoming. We're talking about quality, technical, safety standards. We're talking, of course, about a very well-designed certification of the decarbonized nature of hydrogen, and the ability of putting in place a very stable, coherent, clear a set of support measures for these projects to happen. So, to create a stable relationship with the key trading partners, we would need to, as we mentioned, ensure the acceptability and respect the principle of additionality. Make sure that this could be an occasion to foster industrial development. What we proposed also is the possibility to establish a high-level roundtable between trading partners, so between exporting and importing countries, and to develop ideally a joint hydrogen roadmap. So conclusions: we need to imports. It was very clear from our analysis, with about half of the projected demand needed to be imported. We need to make sure that hydrogen will have really important implications on energy security, technology security, on prices. So all these considerations need to be taken into account. The strategy needs to be coherent with the rest of the energy strategies, in particular with the electricity sector. The renewables are key, but we want to avoid we would like to concentrate more on the CO2 content of the hydrogen production, therefore respecting more the idea of technology neutrality. The huge investments with the need of capital and coordination of access to capital and coordination of infrastructure, and of course the very important role of cooperation with the trading partners going forward. I am sorry if I took a few more minutes. This is the end of the presentation. I will be happy later on to reply to any questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Marco, for this really clear and straightforward presentation. And I think it once again reveals your long energy expertise that you gained in the International Energy Agency and many other places. So thank you very much. That was most interesting. And I think the results really fit very well to what we've already discussed also within the 2 previous studies the World Energy Council on hydrogen already did. One on the import countries that we identified, including Northern Africa, Morocco, for instance. And second, to what extent do these countries already deal with strategies or have already formulated hydrogen strategies themselves and included the trading idea in these strategies. Now from theory into practice, into policy, and the question, how could relationships, trading relationships look like? Could be initiated. The German government in its national hydrogen strategy very early implemented the idea of building up jointly together partnerships with exporting countries that could be able to deliver hydrogen or its derivatives. And for that reason, I'm very glad to welcome Ulrich Benterbusch, the Deputy Director General for Energy Efficiency, Gaseous Carriers and Heat Networks from the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy. An often guest in our rounds, Mr. Benterbusch, the floor is yours. Sorry, we can't hear you, Ulrich.
Yeah. Okay, now it should work. That's the classic thing. Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Marco, for this interesting presentation. And thanks also, Carsten, to the World Energy Council for this, study that comes, at a very timely moment. We are always very, very happy when we see that, important work is done outside, let's say, the government, but which in fact is very compatible to our strategy and our thinking. And let me briefly highlight a couple of points regarding your studies, what I think is our most valuable findings, and then briefly in a second intervention, in a short a couple of sentences, let me kind of comment on what we are doing really to get these imports started, because I think that's also crucial. I think first and foremost, it is good and important that all the hydrogen strategies, not only the national ones, but in Europe, the strategies of the EU fit together, and that we all have, let's say, in our policy work, that we are coming from, let's say, the same basic assumptions. And it is really, really good that we have now this common denominator that hydrogen, CO2-free hydrogen, is an essential part of any successful strategy to reach climate neutrality, be it in 2045 or 50. And that, I think, is the basic difference to earlier hypes around hydrogen. We have, and our analysis has also clearly shown, that whatever happens in the German case, we will have to import large quantities of hydrogen rather sooner than later, because the resource endowment on national German soil for renewable electricity is limited, onshore and offshore. So we will, of course, need to import a lot of, hopefully, green molecules from European partners, be it in the EU or partners in Europe outside the EU. And in this context, I would clearly also integrate, of course, Norway, but of course also our Russian friends. These potentials we have to use. It is very, very important, and you stress that in your studies, that we pursue an open approach with regard to technologies. You know that in our national strategy, we clearly indicate that from the government's viewpoint, only green hydrogen, the one from green electricity, is in the longer term sustainable. But at the same time, we have to see that with regard to the situation in Europe, there are other important member countries who want to produce hydrogen from different sources, be it through steam reforming based on methane, or from nuclear energy, in particular here France, but also other countries. So that is something that needs to be decided at national level, and we need to be open for these imports as well, as it is true for green electrons. I have not observed that at the border to France or Belgium, in the connectors for electricity, there is a so-called filter that stops, electrons from nuclear energy invading our country. So I can't see anything, that will stop molecules, coming through a European hydrogen pipeline grid, if they are produced from nuclear energy to Germany. And I only foresee that if we have too many political debates, we'll, let's say, try to impose one over the other, that may block developments in Europe, which with regard to the ramp up of the market, which will not be helpful. Cost reduction is crucial, and that is why we are hoping very much that the regulatory pieces that we need for investments in hydrogen production capacities, green ones, will be removed rather quickly. But that is still not absolutely clear. But you are describing this in your study from your viewpoint, of course, in the right manner. But in detail, what of course is now on the political agenda is the delegated act to implement the RED II provisions for that. And this is, of course, a very, very central piece for the question whether the market ramp up can take place or not. It's not the only one, but it is a decisive one. Infrastructure is, of course, key as well, no doubt about it, and we will have to come to a much more integrated system of planning. So in this point, we fully agree with the findings of your studies, that also really supports our view. And we do hope that once we have the new government and we can read through the new coalition treaty, that we will then, of course, hopefully also have some provisions or some work to do, because I think our politicians recognize and have to recognize that infrastructure planning, in particular with regard to gas and hydrogen and electricity grids, needs to be much more integrated than it was hitherto done. I would like to add in this context that we have pipelines in our project pipeline of the IPCEI projects, a range of infrastructure projects. And if the Commission gives us a green light for those projects, we will develop in the next years in Germany the backbone of a national hydrogen grid, which will encompass up to 1,700 kilometers. So that's already not a small thing, really a backbone that could later on really help to develop the markets and give it a broader range. I stressed already the question of the regulatory framework. I think I don't need to go into that detail again, but it's absolutely crucial from our viewpoint. For external partners from outside, that's my second part. We have, of course, to a certain extent, similar issues when it comes to regulation. You are maybe aware that the German government is preparing a program called H2 Global. That is where we want, via auctions, to buy green hydrogen products or derivatives. So that will be an auction where exporters can commit to produce, let's say, 1,000, 2,000 tons of synthetic kerosene for 10 years. So we have already a foundation that will then buy this stuff and contract it and will sell it on the local market, and the cost difference will be covered by the government, by the national budget. That is, I think, a powerful tool to get exporters intrigued to develop capacities, you know, small at the beginning, but to establish international value chains. But of course, also in this context, the question are what criteria make sure that it's really sustainable. The additionality question when it comes to electricity will be posed. And of course, here we also need certificates of origins rather sooner than later. And of course, process of certification that will assure that, you know, you can later on import these products and that they are, you know, accepted as green products and fall under the respective regulations that we need. Because when we want to import, you know, synthetic fuels, for example, we need all these kind of certificates and regulations so that they are acknowledged. But that are still new developments, also in terms of regulation with regard to the Commission. But I think these pieces of regulation and legislation are key also to, you know, get partners outside of Europe to produce and export. And of course, we suppose that, you know, it will be the derivates that we will import first, because the transport of hydrogen as such, in particular via ship, will be very difficult. If it's pure hydrogen, then we expect it via pipelines, maybe from Norway first or others, but that is certainly something we also need to work on. And therefore, and that is my last point, we do hope very much that our coalition treaty will give us also as a government the mandate to develop a national import strategy. Because this, you know, this question of imports doesn't fall from heaven. It needs policy initiatives, negotiations, maybe treaties, and that is something we need to work on in the next years very intensively to make sure that these imports really come when we need them. With that, I want to close my short intervention, Carsten, and of course, I'm happy to answer any questions colleagues may have.
Well, thank you very much, Ulrich, for bringing together, I think, the study results to political life, to the budgets restrictions, but also to the challenges that are ahead of us in terms of the European Union's next gas package, of course, where in December, hopefully, some of the questions you raised around certification and around infrastructure might get an answer.